In Two Minds, written and read by Katie Finlay. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. The Strands of Life. Fresh bread, now leather, then cheese, next cattle. Every breath filled his lungs with a different smell as Wulfstan raced through the palace marketplace at top speed. He threw out his arms to counterbalance a jink around a large lady carrying a basket of wood and slightly increased his lead. As long as there were people and things to run around, he could stay ahead. He'd always been the nimbler of the two. The pair raced on, jumping over a pig here, twisting around a stack of spears there, flashing through the blast of heat from the smith's forge, until they hit the wall of the Market Street warehouse. Wulfstan turned sharply to the left, again stretching his lead a fraction. He was running as fast as he could go, but he knew he was in trouble now. Ethelwulf was faster in a straight line, and he was sure to close the gap. Wulfstan couldn't go right because of the wall, and the stalls, animals and produce to his left didn't have a gap where even a 10-year-old boy could fit. Above his own ragged breathing, he could hear Ethelwulf's pounding feet getting closer and closer. Surely he must be almost able to touch him, and then the game would be over. If he could just reach the corner, he might be able to lose his pursuer. 20 feet, 10, 5, made it! Wulfstan's shoes scrabbled for grip in the gravel as he turned hard right. Halfway round the bend, he risked to look back. Ethelwulf was indeed almost upon him, fingers outstretched towards Wulfstan's back, but he was already running wide and losing ground. Yes! Wulfstan exulted, planning to do a spin turn and head back into the market. He heard the noise of the impact, and a brilliant flash of light filled his brain. There was no pain, just a sense of floating. Standing above Wulfstan's body, Hengist looked down in horror. He'd had time to twist his sword before it hit the boy's head, but couldn't stop the swing. The flat of the blade had hit hard on the left side of the skull, and Wulfstan's body simply crumpled at his feet. The young face gazed sightlessly up at him, blood oozing through the hair, falling each side of the ear, staining his cheek and neck before pooling in the grass. Hengist's sparring partner gasped, "You've killed the king's son!" A crowd was already beginning to form, and the clamour, yammer and uproar of dismay began to rise. A world away, an old man was working on a life-size diorama in the Dark Ages section of the Wulfstan Museum. He adjusted the dummy Anglo-Saxon warrior until its spear was held vertically and bent to pick up a cloak from the floor. He groaned inwardly as his sciatica stabbed ruthlessly down into his legs. Henry, 15 years old with an inquiring mind, had a burning question. "Thomas, why were people back then so dumb?" Thomas Woodcock, the museum's curator, smiled gently. "Any specific examples you have in mind, Henry?" He carefully set the cloak around the warrior's shoulders, making sure the chest armour was still partly visible. Henry frowned. "Well, what about thinking the sun goes around the earth instead of the way it really goes? I mean, that's obvious." He flicked his head to clear the fringe out of his eyes so he could see to put on the dummy sandals. There was a short pause. But I wonder what it would look like to us down here if the sun really did move around the earth." There was a longer pause while Henry digested this and thought about the answer. Finally he sighed and said, "You mean it would look exactly the same unless you knew what to look for?" Thomas smiled, eyes sparkling behind his bifocals. "Exactly. Next example." He dropped down on his knees with a quiet groan, moved a knotted rope aside and began to make chalk marks on the floor. Henry was ready, keen to level the score. "Okay, how about choosing base 12 instead of the decimal system for numbering things? All that 12 inches to a foot rubbish. The decimal system is so much easier to use." Again there was a smile on the face of the old man. "Up to a point. Divide 10 by 3 for me. 3 1/3. 10 by 4. 2 1/2. 10 by 6? 1 2/3. "Did you find that easy?" asked Thomas, his smile widening just a little. "No, of course not," snapped Henry. "I had to really think." "Okay then, let's try this. Divide 12 by 3. 4. 12 by 4. 3. 12 by 6. 2. Thomas nodded happily. "So, if you didn't have a calculator, and were measuring stuff to make a castle, or weighing out equal portions of bread for your villagers, which would be easier, dividing into 10 or dividing into 12? "Oh," said Henry thoughtfully, "you mean 12 can be divided by more numbers, so it's easier to use." "Yep, and we can use it to make stuff too. Look at this," Thomas said, picking up the knotted strand of rope off the floor. "At every foot along this cord we've tied a knot, and it's 12 feet long." "So?" asked Henry. Thomas stood up, wincing as his knees creaked and cracked. Here, you take one end and I'll take the other. Now, we can use it like a tape measure for counting the knots, but that's just beginner's stuff." "What else can it do?" asked Henry. "Pull it out straight, away from me until the third knot, and put it on the floor. That makes a 3-foot length." Thomas carefully knelt down and put his left hand on the knot. "Now, I'll hold this in position while you pull the rope off to the right and count out another 4 knots." Henry did as he was asked. "Okay," said Thomas. "You hold that knot up there and throw me the other end of the rope. Now, keep the 4-foot line straight and taut, but allow the rope to move left or right as I pull the end you just gave me." Thomas held down the knot in his left hand and moved the free end of the rope back down to touch the original end to make a triangle. Henry allowed his knot to move and kept the rope tight on both the lines that now came from it. "Now, my friend," said Thomas, "if the sides of a triangle are 3, 4, and 5 units long like this one, you get a right-angle triangle, every single time. We can use rope, string, cloth, wire, anything at all to make it, and it will always be a right-angle triangle. Once you're certain you've got 90 degrees, you can then divide that up so you can measure any angle you want to. And that means you can make pretty much anything, and it'll all fit together properly. Watch." Thomas picked up a yardstick and marked out the right angles 2 lines with chalk. Then, holding the right-angled knot, he grabbed the next knot along with the chalk and pulled it down to the other line, marking a perfect quarter circle. He rubbed his hands together to get rid of the chalk dust. "Now, that curve is 90 degrees, so if we break it into 10 equal parts, we'll have 10 wedges of 9 degrees each. Divide each of them into 3, we'll have 3 smaller ones, and divide each of those by 3 again, and we have a protractor with 1-degree marks. We've just made a protractor with nothing more than a piece of rope, and can now measure any angle we want. This isn't just a knotted bit of rope, it's a computer and a drawing tool." Henry shook his head in wonder. "I had no idea." Thomas nodded, his slightly too long hair flicking into his eyes. He brushed it away. "All technology is like that. You need to know how to use it before it makes sense. Your mobile phone is the most useful thing you own, but give it to an Anglo-Saxon and it's just a pretty box you can't even put things in. Useless, in fact." Henry mulled it over for a moment or two. "So is it always like that? Is it always that there's a reason for something, but it looks stupid to us because we've forgotten the thinking behind it?" The old man laughed. "Not always. Sometimes they had it completely wrong, but culture, religion, or politics locked their head into a box and they couldn't get out of it. They needed a rebel, like Galileo, to break the mould and move on." "Or you," said Henry, and they both burst into laughter. The pair worked in silence for the next few minutes until Thomas offered a contrasting thought. "Funny folk, the Saxons," he murmured, while twisting the warrior's spear. "You couldn't find a braver people anywhere, but too wedded to their own macho sense of honour to ever be truly great, in my opinion. That's a good example of a cultural belief getting in the way." Henry, examining the warrior's pattern-welded sword, was a little taken aback. He was proud of his Anglo-Saxon origins. "What do you mean? They did all right until the Normans came along, didn't they?" Thomas was fiddling again with the spear and did not look up. "You know those violent criminal gangs we have these days, like the Mafia? Well, I reckon the Saxons weren't that different from them, especially in times of war. Might is right and personal honour were their catch-cries. Oh, sure, they had the odd-gifted king like Alfred the Great, who did tremendous things, but you only have to look at King Harold's family to see what it was usually like." The old man stepped back for a last look and walked off to the next job. Henry picked up the toolbox and followed him down the hall. A 5-minute walk found the pair of them on the mezzanine floor above the Anglo-Saxon display. They spent the next hour attending to the steam engine to be used in the following day's demonstration, and then went home. Morning found Thomas and Henry back at said engine, surrounded by a group of young schoolchildren from the local high school's junior science class. "The thing about steam," Thomas was saying, "is that the engine often seems like a living thing." He looked carefully over his young audience and then gestured at the inert machine. "It doesn't seem like it at the moment, I'll admit, but we can soon change that." Animatedly, he reached up and pulled the whistle cord. The whistle is meant to tell people to stand clear, but it also tells us that we have pressure in the boiler. Blowing the whistle releases a tiny amount of that pressure. Can anyone tell us how else we might release it? He looked around the sea of faces. Between the spots and freckles, Thomas could see the typical reluctance of the teenager to draw attention to itself. He sighed inwardly and continued, "The most obvious way is to allow it to operate the machine." And stepping to the rear of the steam engine, he pulled a lever that set the pistons into motion. "You can hear it breathing now as the pistons move in and out. It's that breathing sound that captures the imagination and makes it seem as if it's alive. The children stepped back slightly in alarm as the piston began to gather speed, and the huffing and chuffing drifted up from gentle wheeze to frenetic and athletic gasps. Henry, enjoying the show, knew another way to release pressure. Sensing that Thomas was having trouble grabbing the kid's attention, he was contemplating a joke. Thomas moved back down the side of the engine and gestured out over the balcony of the mezzanine floor to the exhibits below. "Half the stuff you can see down there would never have existed if it had not been for engines like these." He turned back to his audience, resting his backside on the railing. "In fact..." His sentence was abruptly cut off by a huge cloud of shrieking steam that enveloped him as Henry hit the release valve. Childish screams almost drowned out the blast and tapered off only as the laughing teen released the valve and bounded around the machine to see the state of his victim. Thomas was no longer there. Henry stared blankly, puzzlement creasing his young brow. A young girl, horror written deep in her face, pointed to the balustrade and gasped, "He fell over the rail!" Appalled, Henry rushed to the edge and looked down. Below lay Thomas, now a key fixture in the diorama, with the spear that he himself had placed with such care thrusting out through his chest. "Thomas!" screamed Henry, and then spinning on his heels he made a mad panic dash for the stairs. Thomas watched him go. From his viewpoint, about 6 feet above the mezzanine floor, he could see all that was going on. He was puzzled by the fact that one of the things he could clearly see was apparently himself. The more he looked at it, the more glad he was that it definitely wasn't him, because it didn't look too comfortable. As Henry reached the body and started searching desperately for signs of life, Thomas, now floating about the level of the mezzanine floor, became aware of something above him. Looking up, he saw what looked like the entrance to a brilliant white tunnel. He flew away from it, down towards the floor, following a thin, gleaming white strand that connected him to his body, and he could clearly see now that it really was his own body. Equally clear was the fact that the wound was fatal, and he was going to die very, very soon. Strangely, this didn't disturb him much. He was much more concerned about Henry and the amount of anguished guilt etched onto his young face. He laid his hand gently on the boy's shoulder, but Henry didn't seem to notice, and was now commanding one of the children to call the ambulance while he tried to support the body. Some of the children were in tears, others sobbing in fright, but about half simply stared at the sight of Henry cradling the body in his arms, watching the growing bloodstain that steadily covered more and more of his clothes. Then Thomas felt himself being gently lifted up from the floor. He looked up to see the tunnel had followed him down. Before he could even try to resist, it softly and silently sucked him in, and up he went. He twisted to look back down, and was astonished at how far away he was already. Very quickly, the only thing visible was the thin strand that connected him to his body. It was getting thinner by the second. "Oh well," he thought, "it's an adventure. There's nothing I seem to be able to do about it. Let's see where things lead. At least the arthritis doesn't seem to hurt anymore." Suddenly, about 10 feet away to his right, another tunnel flashed into life, visible through the walls of his own. As he watched, the young boy in it seemed to drift upwards with him, keeping pace. The boy had spotted him too, and was smiling and waving. Thomas reciprocated. Each curious about the other, the two moved to the walls of their respective tunnels to see more clearly. Thomas put his hand up against the wall of his tunnel. The boy did likewise. Suddenly, and without warning, the two tunnels swung rapidly towards each other, and the two hands were placed palm to palm. Thomas tried to pull his away, but it was glued in place. The boy's face registered real fear, and he too struggled to wrench himself free. He screamed, but Thomas could hear nothing. The wall of the tunnel slowly changed colour and began to become more translucent than transparent. Then abruptly it split, like water when a diver plunges into a pool and the two hands properly met. A heartbeat later, Thomas was sucked from his own tunnel into the boy's. The hole slammed shut behind him, and even before Thomas could turn around to look, his own tunnel winked out of existence. His silvery cord, severed now, lashed wildly around, both man and boy ducking their heads instinctively to avoid it as it flashed past their faces. Hands stuck together, they were like German duelists in a men's sewer, unable to pull apart, waiting to see who would be struck first. In the end, it was the boy who took the blow full on the forehead. The cord welded itself firmly into place. The child recoiled in horror, his screams now horribly audible, and tried to jink sideways away from Thomas. The cord stretched easily, but their hands remained welded together, resisting the boy's efforts to free himself. "Calm down, lad," yelled Thomas, himself on the edge of panic, but it was no use. The boy was lost to his fear, and then they were tumbling end over end back down the boy's tunnel. For just a second they fell free of it before smashing into what Thomas assumed was a body. The boy shot straight through it, which convulsed with the impact. When Thomas hit, a fleeting sheet of pain shot across his head, which vanished as he too carried on out the other side and into another tunnel, this one dark as night. It wasn't completely black, though. He could actually see, but the walls of this new tunnel were a very dark grey, almost completely lacking in sparkle or lustre, lifeless except for the odd strangely black glints that sparkled as they fell. But there was an upside. The trip through the body had stripped his cord from the boy's face and also freed their hands. They fell separately now, each trailing their own silvery strand back to the body, the boy accelerating away from him. A red glow began to appear in the distance. Rapidly it grew both larger and brighter, silhouetting the boy's spinning form. The child's screams seemed to echo off the tunnel walls, and then abruptly the volume dropped as he fell clear of the tunnel into open space. For another 5 seconds the pair tumbled down into a huge cavern. A second is a precise measurement of time. All well-adjusted clocks will count one off, regularly and in harmony with their colleagues, but there can be a huge difference in how long a second feels. A child reading a favourite book in the few minutes left before lights out thinks a second is cruelly short and stolen away before proper use could be got out of it. A man tumbling vertically into a lake of boiling lava thinks a second lasts for a very long time indeed. He thinks he has never held his breath for so long. He thinks longingly of cool, refreshing water. He thinks of things he has done, both treasured and regretted acts of childhood. Only one of those seconds is gone. In the next he thinks longingly of his first real love, and the pain of discovering he was only her infatuation for the day. He thinks of the girl he married, their wedding day, her smiles and laughter. He thinks of his daughter, her birth, her first steps, her first book, her kiss goodnight on her 7th birthday in her new pyjamas. And there are still 3 seconds to go. He thinks of his work. Was it worthwhile? Was it a waste? Should he have taken that promotion? Why didn't he see that opportunity? But that was good. That idea really worked. It pleased many people. He smiles at the thought. There are 2 seconds yet to go. Is there any way out of this? The heat is fierce on his face, his hands, and it's getting stronger all the time. Will he feel the burn at the finish, or will it all be over in an instant? Will he drown? Will he be burned alive? Will he be crushed by the weight of the molten rock? Will he simply smash onto the surface as if it's ice, and then sink beneath it, flames flickering over his body as it goes down? And now, there's just 1 second left. What's going to happen? Is there an afterlife? Is there a soul? Who got it right? All those religions, each purporting to be the right and only one, each demanding they be taken on faith, without questioning. That's all very well, but how would you know? In the quiet of the pub, enjoying a pint and a chat, you could be academic about it all. After all, there was so much life left to live. There was time for debate. Now, 1 second from incineration, the debate seemed much more real somehow. Had he made the right choice? What if it was wrong? Was it too late to change? If he was given some new information, could he reconsider? And then it was over. Time's up. Thomas closed his eyes, and kept them closed, for a long time. The heat still baked his face, but it hadn't got worse. Cautiously, he opened his eyes again. He hung about 10 feet above the lake's surface, from the slenderest of threads. He twisted his head. 20 feet to his left he could see the boy, likewise suspended, mouth frozen open in terror. Another 20 feet beyond that lay what he thought was the edge of the lake, but swirling clouds of sulphurous gas made it impossible to be sure. Were those vague shapes amongst the clouds people of some kind? He tried to move, and discovered that he could fly quite easily. He slid over to the boy, then reached up and carefully grabbed his own cord. He pulled gently, and was pleased to note that the lava was a little further away. On the other hand, the extra height allowed him to see more clearly through the billowing clouds, and there seemed to be a lot more of the strange shapes. They appeared to be moving, and somehow they alarmed him even more than the lava did. Time to leave, he thought. Thomas gazed into the boy's eyes, gently put out both his hands and said, "I'm just as lost as you, but," he nodded towards the shapes, "I don't think this is the right place for us. Wouldn't you rather go home?" "Yes, please," sobbed the boy, his eyes pleading. "Then give me a hug and hold on tight." The two clasped their arms around each other, and Thomas slowly spun on the spot, spinning the two strands into a single cord. He pulled gently, and slowly they started to ascend back towards the roof of the cavern, slipping into the welcome, cooling embrace of the tunnel. Initially they were travelling slowly enough for Thomas to notice that the light on the walls came from small pieces of jet set in what was otherwise a granite-like surface. The boy's fingers gripped hard, nails stabbing into his shoulder, and even harder when they began to accelerate. The boy buried his face ever deeper into Thomas's neck, shutting out the view of the walls flashing past. The pieces of jet were moving past so quickly now that Thomas could no longer see them individually, and the walls once more became the shimmering grey he had seen on the way down. For an instant they fell free of the tunnel before slamming hard into Wulfstan's body. Hengist gasped, as without warning the corpse jerked itself 3 feet off the ground, tumbling and somersaulting before crashing back to earth. Thomas heard screams erupting all around him, and the thunder of many feet running away. His head shrilled in a pain such as he'd never felt before. He held it in his hands and rolled around on the ground, moaning. "Your Highness, you're alive!" gasped Hengist. A world away, Henry felt Thomas's body go completely limp, becoming quite literally a dead weight in his hands. Tears streaming down her face, a little girl reached out and gently closed his eyes. It seemed the right thing to do.